Welcome to Europe from Poverty to Prosperity, Week 2. Remember last week we talked a little bit about unsuccessful civilizations and changing conditions, and we introduced this concept of implosion. The combination of internal and external problems as the center of a nation or an empire weakens and the periphery becomes subject to invasions. We're going to refer to this at least 2 times during this lecture. And so keep this in mind, internal weaknesses and external strengths. And we're going to be talking about the so-called barbarian invasions, both of Rome and of medieval Europe. I like this little comic strip that we have of Rome. We have a great idea, Caesar, instead of taxes, we'll call them roaming charges. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about taxation in Rome today. And so what we're going to do is start you off with Rome. We're going to build up Rome for you, and then we're going to tell you how internally it's eaten away by economic problems, social problems, political problems, and then once it's eaten away at the center, how it takes some centuries, several centuries, to really start to fall apart and eventually fall prey to barbarian invasions. So let's first look a little bit at Rome, the Italian peninsula itself. And so off here you have Corsica and Sardinia, the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. You have running up and down north to south as kind of a spine of the Italian peninsula, the Apennine Mountains. Up here to the northwest are the Alps Mountains. You're going to be seeing different tribes like the Gauls, the Etruscans, the Latins, Campania down here. This is, of course, in the area of the boot of Italy, and we have down here a lot of Greeks who settled in this area in Sicily, on the island of Sicily. We also have Carthaginians who settled down here, and we're going to be talking a lot about the Punic Wars today, which really pitted the Romans against Carthage in 3 major wars. So we're going to be talking about those too. So this is just to give you an idea geographically of what we're talking about. So we talked a little bit about the Alps and the Apennines. And also you notice that Italy is really a peninsula. That is a body of land surrounded on 3 sides by water. And we talked a little bit about how the Greeks had settled in city-states. The polis of Greek history was really a city-state, and how the Greeks had settled in places like Sicily and Naples in Syracuse. And then along about 800 BC, the Etruscans moved into Italy, into central Italy. We can see that as demonstrated right here, not far from the Tiber River. We're also going to be talking about the Arno River, the Po River, etc. And no one knows really where the Etruscans came from. Some people suggest that they came from further east, from Asia, because some of their cultural ways seemed oriental. For instance, they practiced divination by inspecting the livers of animals and things of that sort. Perhaps the Etruscans were a mixture of peoples, including a small group of leaders that migrated to Italy from the east and then maybe mixed with the native peoples of the Italian peninsula. Whatever, they settled between the Tiber and the Arno rivers, where they founded cities. And from that point in time, they spread north and south. Now, keeping all that in mind, according to legend, the city of Rome on the Tiber River was established by the semi-divine brothers Romulus and Remus. And Romulus, it's kind of a Cain and Abel story. Both of them were abandoned and supposedly nursed by a she-wolf. And eventually Romulus grew up and killed Remus. And so Romulus gives his name to to Rome. And the Romans had a very specific date for this. Of course, we all know that, the Romans didn't say BC before Christ, or as we sometimes call it BCE, before the Common Era, before the Christian era, because they didn't know, obviously, that somewhere along the line, Venerable Bede in the Middle Ages, a monk, would develop the dating system of BC AD. But if we use their dating system, the Roman dating system, and apply it to the BC AD, it was about 753 that they claimed that these brothers established Rome. And it's kind of typical of many stories of the establishment of any important civilization. A lot of it is based in fables and mythology, and that is obviously important, or was important, to ancient peoples who saw things quite differently than we do. I mean, obviously they didn't see the need to see everything historically as we do, objectively as we do, dealing only with the facts. They were trying to certainly justify and rationalize their own rule, their own empire, and how their empire was created or connected with the divine. And so all of these things were important justifications. What we do know is that by about 509 BC, Rome became a republic. And Rome was really becoming ascendant at this time. It was, heading up in the world, so to speak. And the Etruscan and Greek cities had begun fighting some years earlier, and hence those were really weakening while Rome was strengthening. One of the things we have to realize about ancient governments, such as the Roman Empire, I want you to realize two important factors. Unlike, many modern governments today, like those in Europe or those of the United States, ancient civilizations, ancient governments did not really practice a separation of powers. In the United States we have, an executive branch headed up by the president, and we have a judicial branch headed up by the Supreme Court, and we have a legislative branch headed up by Congress. Back in those days, in terms of civil jurisdiction, say things that we would regard as more executive functions, carrying out the government on a daily basis. Criminal jurisdiction, things that we would regard as being judicial and courts. Military affairs, all of those things were sometimes centered in the same kind of government without a separation of political powers. And so we have to kind of get rid of our own cultural baggage when we begin to look at ancient governments. The second thing we need to realize is they had no idea, like we do today, of a separation between church and state. There simply was no separation between religion and the state. And very oftentimes the principal ruler could take on a divine or semi-divine kind of image. This certainly was true in Rome, where, the emperor always had this sort of semi-divine image, and the Romans, whether or not they believed it, would go ahead and, quote-unquote, worship the emperor. And, of course, this caused problems later on for the Christians who felt that, since the emperor was not divine, they didn't want to worship the emperor, and it caused all kinds of problems. Early on, so what happens when Rome became a republic? A republic is a government that promotes the common good or the common welfare of all or almost all people. Now, that's as opposed to very special interests. Now, obviously, Rome had slaves, so its government wasn't terribly concerned about the common good of the slaves, etc. But Rome did feel that for this republic to function and to be successful, that its citizens, Roman citizens, obviously not slaves, etc., but Roman citizens would need to practice civic virtue. That is, they should be virtuous. They should have an understanding of their responsibilities to the Roman state, to the Roman Empire. Their need to be cooperative with one another, and their need to work for the common good of the state, to not be individualistic, to not be self-centered. And this third, and we could almost count this as the number 3, this idea of a community working together, communitarian kind of values, of civic virtue, is something that we don't have so much in modern times, especially in a democratic republic of the United States, where we tend to be very individualistic. We tend to put the individual first and the group second. But with Rome and with other ancient governments, the opposite was true. There was the importance of putting the community, the state, first, and certainly, at the very last, an individual. Now, throughout Roman history, there was, and this is where we get into an understanding early on of the differences between poverty and prosperity, there was a struggle between the orders, a struggle of the orders. And what they're talking about at that time was really 2 elements of the class structure. The first was composed of the upper class, the patrician class. The patricians were the wealthy, the aristocracy, call them the nobility, whatever you want to call them. On the other hand of the spectrum were the plebeians. And the plebes were literally the lower class, the commoners, the common people. They would have been small farmers, laborers, artisans, craftsmen, furniture makers, shoemakers, bakers, butchers, tailors, people of that sort. So there were really only 2 major classes in Rome, the patricians and the plebeians, because there really was no middle class to speak of. We don't really start talking about an important middle class until we start getting to the time of the Enlightenment, and slowly the first industrial revolution, the beginnings of capitalism. We're going to see a little bit of that today when we speak of the French Revolution and the bourgeoisie, that is kind of the growing middle class. But at the time of Rome, we're really not talking any middle class. So the plebeians were not really terribly happy with how they were treated sometimes by the patricians, by the upper class. So between about 494 and 287 BC, over a 100-year period, the plebeians held 5 general strikes to obtain their rights. That is, they literally withdrew from the city of Rome. And, without the plebeians performing all of the labor for the city of Rome, and the plebeians were needed, by the way, for their military services, eventually the patricians had to give in. And what they agreed to do, the patricians, is they agreed to give the plebes, the plebeians, representation. And those representatives of the lower class were called tribunes. And they were recognized as being very important, and they could not be, the tribunes could not be arrested, they could not be intimidated by magistrates, officials of the patrician classes. So this becomes an important safety mechanism for the plebeians when they feel that they need to make their own struggles and voice heard. They have someone representing them, and those are the tribunes. About 450 BC, so this is very early on, the plebeians succeeded in getting another very important thing enacted. And it was called the Law of the 12 Tables. And it was literally a written law code. Now, that is very important because in a republic, and you know, it's not that old as a republic, right? 509 BC, this is about 450 BC. But in a republic which says that the government operates for the good of all, not for any special interest, then if you have written laws, then that's very important because then judgment should be based upon those written laws. An illiterate society that has no real, say the plebeians have no real influence, if they committed murder versus a patrician committing murder, would there be two separate ways to judge all of that? When you begin to write things down, you begin to get a consistent law code that should be administered based upon the written law and not, well, I'm going to let you off, you committed murder, but you're a very wealthy, influential, powerful person. Okay, so you see the importance of that. The Roman government was patterned somewhat like the family, which was seen really as the fundamental institution of Rome. The family was seen as the guardian, really, of all traditions, and the father was expected really to pass on to his children his talents and abilities, his vocation. And really, unlike Greece, there was really no public education that Rome provided for its citizens. Instead, the father was to teach the children a trade. The father was to teach the children to respect their ancestors. In fact, the father would supervise the family worship. Like a family, Republican Rome was headed by two people called consuls. And the consuls held office for 1 year. And each one of the consuls had veto power over the other. And literally veto meaning I object. The Roman government, in addition to the consuls and the tribunes, had many assemblies. The most important advisory body of the Romans was the Senate, which had begun as an advisory body already back in the time of the Etruscan king. Finally, in 287 BC, with the passage of the Hortensian Law, the legislation of the plebeian council, the Concilium Plebis, became binding on both patricians and plebeians alike. So by 287 BC, the council representing the plebeians versus the Roman Senate was making laws that applied to, were binding upon both the upper and the lower classes. And so another thing that we want to talk just a little bit about here is a little bit about how Rome grows and takes over most of the Italian peninsula. About 400 BC, the Gauls moved into Italy. They moved across the Alps into Etruscan territory. And the Gauls were a Celtic, or you sometimes pronounce it Celtic people. They spoke an Indo-European language, and the thing about Celtic is at that time it was spoken in many parts, not only of what today we know as the British Isles, but also in most of France, many parts of Spain, wide areas of Central Europe today. Now when we speak of Celtic languages and Celtic peoples, we're usually talking about Ireland, Scotland, Wales. But back then it was a much larger grouping. And so the Celtic invasions of Italy occurred before and after 400 BC. And where exactly they came from, probably Central Europe, nobody knows for certain. But anyhow, they passed over the Alps. All the tribes of the Gauls, with their women and children, their flocks and herds, their chariots, their wagons, their pack animals, they fanned out over the plains. And many of the invaders finally settled down and became good farmers in north of Rome. And in 387 or 386 BC, the Romans, fearing an invasion from the Gauls, decide to march against the Gauls first. And, we know that is the best defense is sometimes a good offense. So the Romans moved north, and they met the Gauls, the Roman troops did, at a small stream flowing northwards into the Tiber about 11 miles from Rome called Allia. The Romans were defeated by the Gauls. They fled. The Gauls followed them all the way to Rome and sacked and burned Rome. Rome rebuilt, however. It was not defeated totally. And this time, when it rebuilt with a 12-foot thick, 24-foot high wall, 5.5 miles long, encircling the entire city, called the Servian Wall. So the Romans quickly began to learn that in order to be a stable state militarily, they had to do all of the right things, and sometimes that meant build very successful defenses like the Servian Wall. Eventually, Rome took more and more pieces of the Italian peninsula over until by about 275 BC, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River Valley. And so this particular map shows the growth of the Roman provinces under the Republic and all the way up to the time, really, of Julius Caesar. And the reason why I like it is it's going to show you some things happening here in terms of the Punic Wars. And so by the start of the First Punic War, here we see Rome, as I said, what it looked like. Did not, of course, include Sicily at that time, just the peninsula itself. And then by the close of the Third Punic War, it included everything that is slashed this way. And then by the death of Caesar, it included everything slashed this way, because, as we know, Julius Caesar was involved in expanding the empire in places like Gaul and over here in the Near East, right? So, well, as early as the 10th century BC, the Phoenicians, who were from Phoenicia, located between Egypt and Assyria, had begun to frequent the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Cyprus and Egypt, Greece and Italy, Africa and Spain knew the Phoenician ships. They knew the goods that the Phoenicians carried in them, the latest arms and weapons, linens and woolen fabrics, purple dyes, painted vases, glassware, and ornaments made out of ivory, gold, and precious stone, all products of the famous workshops of Sidon and Tyre. In exchange, the Phoenicians carried back to Phoenicia copper, lead, tin, silver, gold, and other raw materials. They found these, everywhere from Britain, where they went in search of tin, to copper and silver in Spain. So the Phoenicians were the great navigators of the ancient world. To facilitate this exchange of goods, the Phoenicians established small trading posts on both sides, on both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic shores, and along the coast of North Africa, and they formed colonies in Spain, in Corsica, in Sardinia. Remember, Corsica and Sardinia are those two giant giant islands off of the west coast of Italy, and they established a colony in North Africa, which was called Carthage, and which we already showed you on the prior map. And eventually, it seemed almost inevitable that these two great powers, Carthage, and by this time Carthage really had functioned as its own empire, Carthage and the Romans would come to blows. And they would fight 3 wars. The first Punic Wars, the first one was from 264 to 241. And during the course of that war, the Romans seized the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. That's kind of the important thing about that war. During the Second Punic War, the great Carthaginian general Hannibal would end up, going over to the Italian peninsula, crossing over the Alps with his great tanks of the ancient world, literally his elephants, which were, as I said, like tanks of the ancient world. And 60,000 men and elephants Hannibal had. And he worked his way up and down the Italian peninsula, destroying really everything in sight. And at the end of it all, he was defeated. And this is also a war that involved an ally of Hannibal, Philip V of Macedon. Macedon was north of really what we know as Greece. And the great Roman general Scipio, who ended up being victorious. And the victory meant that Hannibal and the Carthaginians needed to withdraw from Italy. Well, because Philip V had allied himself of Macedonia with Hannibal, it was time for Rome to punish Macedonia. And eventually, at the end of the Macedonian Wars, Rome divided Greece into 4 republics. In the Third Punic War, which went on to 146 BC, what actually happened is Rome literally destroyed Carthage absolutely and completely, burned the city to the ground, and even sowed salt into the soil to make certain that nothing would grow there for years and years. Now, what is significant about this? Well, at the end of the Punic Wars, obviously Rome is the top dog in the Mediterranean. It will continue to take over more and more of Europe. Julius Caesar and what we now call France, the area of the Gauls. It will continue to expand into the Middle East, and by the time that Jesus Christ is born, we know that Palestine is literally a province of Rome, right? So it would seem that the Punic Wars placed Rome on the top. And in essence it did. Militarily, it placed them on the top in terms of territory, etc. Why then are we going to talk about the next slide, the economic, social, and political consequences of the Punic Wars and what they called? Everything was not wonderful after the Punic Wars. But it would take centuries for the problems that were under the surface to begin to really develop and to tear apart Rome and lead it into civil wars and civil disorders. So let's look at these things. Number 1, the Punic Wars left much of the Italian countryside in ruins. We're talking here about great physical losses. For 14 years, the Carthaginians and Hannibal and the Roman armies marched up and down, fighting one another throughout the peninsula, living off the land, seizing and destroying crops, killing livestock, burning down thousands of homes and farm buildings. And after that, literally, the Italian peninsula had to rebuild. Number 2, the Punic Wars led to great human losses as well. Before the Punic Wars, it was estimated that there were 290,000 Roman citizens. By 194 BC, after the Second Punic War, that number was less than half, only 144,000 Roman citizens. Since only those who owned property were eligible for the military draft, this meant that the army would suffer in numbers after this. The third thing is the plight of the farmer soldiers. Some of these farmer soldiers of Rome chose, after the Punic Wars, to remain in the army. To them, the army was much more secure financially. It was a paycheck. It certainly was more exciting in terms of travel, etc. And so some of those farmers who had left their farms to become soldiers during the Punic Wars never really returned to being farmers. But others did return to be farmers back in the Italian peninsula. And what they found there was the devastation that awaited them. Homes and farm buildings ruined, fields overrun with briars and weeds. Some of the farms had been seized for debt by some greedy neighbors. Returned soldiers lucky enough to find their fields and houses intact sometimes did not have the money to raise in order to buy the necessary livestock, oxen, tools, seed that they needed, and many, discouraged, drifted into the city of Rome, hoping to find employment. And of course, the city of Rome was an ancient city of the time. There weren't that many jobs available, so you've got people flocking into Rome looking for employment. Others of these kind of very disappointed, disgruntled farmer soldiers went home, found the farms a mess, and then they went back into the army, and very oftentimes returning to the army and sent to the provinces, the outlying provinces, where, looting and trading paid much better than farming. The fourth thing that we're going to talk about is tribute and its consequences. Because the conquered peoples in the Punic Wars were expected to pay tribute in either silver usually or in grain, right, in agricultural produce, a lot of capital, silver and grain, was pouring into the Roman capital at Rome. And this money, this grain, in fact, it was estimated that perhaps as much as half the grain supply from Rome after the Punic Wars came from Sicily, that island at the boot of Italy. And it came through either tribute or through purchases. So it came either as tribute, which was free, or it came through purchases. That is, cheap grain was flowing into Rome, and also in the form of tribute, grain was flowing into Rome. And so one could ask, how in the world could the farmers of Italy compete against either free grain flowing in as tribute or very inexpensive grain coming from the provinces that had been defeated? The fifth thing that we want to look at is a lot of the conquered peoples of the Punic Wars became slaves. So the Punic Wars brought a plentiful supply of slaves. Greeks, Macedonians, Spaniards, Gauls, Carthaginians into Rome. And everybody knows that slave labor is only efficient in year-round and labor-intensive pursuits. That is, in crops that require attention all year round. And those kinds of crops that require attention all year round in all seasons tended to be things like olives and grapes. So much of the production, the agricultural production of Italy, would change after the Punic Wars. It would change because, number one, why should the farmers be raising grain? How do you compete against free tribute of grain or cheap grain coming in from outlying areas? And second, now with slaves moving into the area and being used in agriculture, it made more sense to use them in the production of things like olives and grapes. So the agricultural foundation of the Italian peninsula began moving into these new, more labor-intensive pursuits. Number 6. What all of this meant is that with all of this capital coming in and these slaves and these new crops like olives and grains, that some of the cultivation of the Italian peninsula changed into larger growers, almost plantations, what were called literally latifundia. And some of this latifundia was developing as cattle ranches or as large estates that grew things like olives and grapes. These large estates, these plantations, these big cattle ranches were owned by the wealthy, worked by slaves. And so the very component of what's happening. Remember, a lot of the small farmers are not going back, and those that do go back are having trouble raising the funds to rebuild their farms, and so some of them go into the army, and so some of them go into Rome, and the end result is there's all of this land passing through hands, and it's becoming concentrated more and more in larger parcels, in plantations, in ranches, in the hands of the wealthy. The 7th thing, which is related. The Punic Wars brought some 14 million acres of confiscated land to the Roman state. Now, what the Romans could have done if they realized it is they could have tried to divide that up and sell it very cheaply or give it to small farmers. But that's a complicated process. And what they did instead is they took the easy way out. And the Roman state took these 14 million acres of confiscated lands and largely distributed them to in large parcels to large investors. So literally it was leasing most of the public land for long terms at small rents to rich and powerful landowners. So it's getting rent in from those, but after a few generations, the property owners, the large landowners, began to regard this property as their own, as not really, rented land, and so many of them simply ceased paying rent to the state. Number 8. The wars emptied the countryside of its free citizens, formerly the backbone of the state, and farmers flocked to Rome. These dispossessed, dissatisfied, disgruntled farmers flocked to Rome, where they lived in shacks or in badly built tenement houses. And they formed, as one historian said, Heckelheim, quote, an unemployed, discontented proletariat, dangerous to the peace and order of the state. They were an unemployed, discontented class, then dangerous to the peace and order of the Roman state. They had to be fed, and they needed to be entertained. And this begins the so-called bread and circuses of Rome. Rich and unscrupulous politicians would buy the votes of these people, even organize them into mobs to influence elections, to create riots, even to kill political opponents. And the violence and anarchy thus introduced, as Heckelheim said, prevailed in Roman politics to the downfall of the Republic. 9. Slavery and revolts. Slavery sowed, in part, the seeds of economic, social, and political decline. And it did this in several ways. 9A, so to speak. The Romans came to regard menial labor as slave labor, and some say that this affected the way they looked at work, that the wealthier Romans began to regard work as something slaves did, and hence the wealthier Romans became lazy. And related to that, a society will not be terribly creative or inventive if it has slave labor. I mean, what's the incentive to get new labor-saving inventions when you've got slaves around to do the work? 9B. The Romans began to treat their slaves with the utmost cruelty and inhumanity. And this treatment that they inflicted upon the slaves was dehumanizing to those who gave it as well as to those who received it. And this is very important. If you treat people with respect and dignity, it actually does affect your own viewpoints. If you treat people with a lack of respect and a lack of dignity, it will end up eating away the very way that you treat other people, including your family members and even your friends and your allies. It's not much wonder that the Roman Senate during the 2nd century began treating foreign peoples such as the Spaniards with the utmost disregard for human life. And this flies right up against that whole idea of the importance of civic virtue and how civic virtue was the foundation for a strong Roman state. 9C. As the wars for conquest ended, the supply of slaves dried up and agriculture declined in Italy. 9D. Slave labor is almost always less efficient than free labor, that is, hired labor, labor that has wages. Number 9E. Slave labor discourages new inventions. Number 9F. Slaves are not consumers. They don't have money. In any economy, even one like ancient Rome, needed to have money and consumers to buy things. And number 9G, in an indirect way, slaves took away jobs from Roman citizens, from Roman peasants. If there weren't all those slaves, there would have been work for all those poor Roman farmers who flock into Rome and need to be fed by bread and entertained by circuses. The result of all this is number 10, civil disorder and civil wars. The rest of Roman history, and we can't go into detail because obviously we don't have time to do that. We're just setting up what is happening here. First, there's an attempt initially to inaugurate reform. Because if you look at it, if they had just done some reforms, the Romans, if they had seen the problem, but they refused to see the problem, right? Their perception of reality did not connect. It did not parallel. Their perceptions were not parallel with the reality on the ground. Nevertheless, the Gracchi brothers tried in 133 BC reform. Tiberius Gracchus tried land reform. He tried to redistribute public lands to the poor. He was a tribune, and another tribune vetoed his bill. And so Tiberius had that tribune removed. Now remember, the tribunes were sacrosanct. They could veto one another's bill. So now Tiberius Gracchus, who had the best intentions in mind, is actually violating the Constitution. And a mob ultimately killed Tiberius Gracchus. He had proposed many unconstitutional measures. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, was also a tribune right around 10 years later, 123 BC, attempted other reforms and was also killed. Then we had generals coming along like Marius and Sulla, Roman generals who began to use the army as their personal tool for their own ambitions. And they began to accept volunteers for the army, mostly these dispossessed farmers and these rural proletarians. And not surprised, when they accepted these volunteers into their army, those poor, dispossessed, disgruntled farmers and people began to be loyal to people like General Marius. These people were loyal and looked up to generals like Marius and Sulla because they had rescued them from the jaws of poverty. The Roman state hadn't done anything for these poor people, but Marius and Sulla had done so. What's dangerous about that? What's dangerous is that Marius and Sulla were using these armies for their own political purposes, and the end result was much violence and much bloodshed. Implosion, internal and external problems were occurring. The internal problems are clear. We said 10 big, giant internal problems. But now let's talk a little bit about the external problems. And one of those was dealing with Mithridates VI, king of Pontus and Asia Minor. And Mithridates VI did not want the Romans in Asia. He wanted to evict them from Asia. And so Sulla, the general Sulla, went after Mithridates, and basically Mithridates gave up his conquest, and while Pontus, his kingdom, remained a kingdom, nevertheless there were rebellions. Sulla returned to Rome in 83 BC, so after, teaching Mithridates a lesson. And Sulla became the first Roman general to lead an army against the officially established government at Rome. The civil war which followed in Rome was bitter. When he was victorious, Sulla had himself appointed dictator in 82 BC, dictator of Rome, no longer a republic. And he said he was going to reform the Roman constitution, but the first thing he was going to do was settle the scores with his opponents. So he placed their names on a white and wooden tablet in the Roman Forum, and anyone who was proscribed was outlawed, and his murderer would receive a reward on producing his head. Many men whose only crime was the possession of wealth were killed because Sulla needed immense quantities of money and land to give to his 120,000 troops. So yes, there's some redistribution of income occurring here, but it's occurring at the price of violence and violation and destruction of the republic and the beginning of a dictatorship. Sulla actually retired in 79 BC, so for 3 years he was a dictator. Excuse me. The slaves were also unhappy, and Spartacus, who was a slave and was a gladiator, began a rebellion in 73-71 BC. And at the height of this rebellion, Spartacus's army of slaves included 120,000 slaves. Half of the slaves of Italy were on the verge of insurrection, and in the capital at Rome, no man could tell when the revolution would break out in his very own home. So Crassus and 40,000 men were given command to squelch the rebellion. Spartacus was defeated, and 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, and there their rotting bodies were left to hang for months, so that all masters might take comfort and all slaves take heed. Pompey, another Roman general returning from Spain at the time, helped to squelch the revolt. And then more stuff happens. Pirates along the Mediterranean. Pompey is sent to defeat them. The pirates were allies of old Mithridates VI, and so Pompey defeated Pontus and annexed that to Rome. Next, Pompey took Antioch in Syria and deposed the last Seleucid king. And in 63 BC, he captured Jerusalem. Jerusalem, excuse me. A little bit here, obviously, about the Roman bread and circuses. This whole thing will continue to fall apart. And so, when you look at things like the first triumvirate, the second triumvirate, Pompey, Crassus, Julius Caesar, all fighting against one another, Caesar making himself dictator for life and being assassinated in 44 BC, then a second triumvirate forming, and finally all of this comes out 27 BC when Octavian became the Emperor Augustus Caesar, and this begins the so-called imperial period of Roman history. Any idea of a Roman Republic for the good of all, civic virtue, is over by this time. So you see how Rome grew, and eventually it would grow all the way up into Britain, as you see here, and all throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, becoming a Mediterranean as well as an Atlantic empire. Well, the Roman Empire would become this giant empire, which would reach to Hadrian's Wall in the British Isles, to the Rhine River, the Black Sea, the Euphrates River, the Sahara Desert, the Atlantic Ocean, and it is so humongous and it had so many internal problems that it became subject to invasions of so-called barbarians, right, from the outside. And we know those barbarians were barbarians in the sense of the Romans. They were not, barbarians as we might call them. But already by the 300s BC, troubles began. 300s, 400s BC with the Vandals and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, etc., etc. And eventually, further and further problems internally with the politics of Rome. Clearly, the Roman Empire was in decline, and it was saved at the most appalling price, so appalling that historians have sometimes said Roman historian Varro, whether it had not better perished. So Diocletian became co-emperor with a man called Maximus, and he passed a whole series of regulations in 324 AD that eased the immediate crisis, but were only a band-aid and not a cure. Indeed, the immediate emergency solutions of Diocletian were ultimately stifling and led to further decline, and as that historian of Rome, R.H. Barrow, expressed it, quote, "The imperial government clamped down upon the whole empire the bars which were to hold it together and which achieved its imprisonment." There were two main reforms of Diocletian, and if you can call them reforms, that's kind of pushing it. One was to settle the problem of succession of the Roman emperor. And so he divided the empire into two, an eastern portion and a western portion, and each was to be headed by an emperor called an Augustus, and each Augustus would have under him a deputy called a Caesar. This was a system called the Tetrarchy, tetrarchy meaning four. But secondly were the disturbing economic changes and reforms that he put together. So the second thing he did is he engaged in price and wage fixing. He literally fixed maximum prices for goods and services. And he defined the prices then for things like food, timber, leather, textiles, cosmetics, and the like. He also went ahead and established heavy new taxation. And, of course, he exempted the wealthiest from taxation. So the taxation was falling upon the lower classes. And then he did something absolutely phenomenal. He fixed workers in their vocations, in their occupations. So literally, the farm laborer could not leave his farm. The tenant farmer could not leave the estate he worked on. The children of those needed to be brought up as tenant farmers or farm laborers. And if overburdened by taxes, the landowner could do something that eventually happened more and more. He could abandon his land, the state would take over the land, confiscate the land, and eventually the greater portion of the Roman Empire passed into state ownership. Positions became hereditary and a caste system occurred. There was no incentive to enterprise or initiative or savings. The state effectively killed them all off, as Barrow said. Production fell, and with it the standard of living, and the rigid uniformity of a lifeless and static mediocrity prevailed. The price of security was the absorption of the individual by the state. And you can read over a little bit here of what happens under Diocletian, what happens under Constantine, who's co-emperor for a while, moving the capital to Byzantium, which he renames Constantinople, Council of Nicaea. This is just all kind of interesting stuff, but it's really not particularly apropos to the discussion at hand, other than to say the following. When Constantine becomes Christian, he gets involved in the Christian church. He gets involved in combating heresy. And you can see here the problems that would ensue when there's no separation between church and state. So Rome is full of problems. By 500 AD, by 476 AD, the Roman Empire in the West, not in the East at Constantinople, but in the West, has fallen. And so ensues the Middle Ages, medieval Europe, and feudalism. Usually we look at medieval Europe as about 500 to 1500, more or less, on either side. And we're looking here at a system of manorialism or seigniorialism. We're going to discuss what a manor was in manorialism. Manorialism is an economic system. And it's an economic system of small manors. And then private armies, so many of these little principalities, manors, had their own private armies. And once they started having their own private armies, we were into the military and political equivalent of economic manorialism, which we called feudalism. The medieval society was composed of those who worked, those who fought, those who prayed. So how does manorialism and feudalism happen? Well, we were seeing it in Rome. Population increases, but without a corresponding increase in land. So since most people are agricultural laborers, the population increases, more and more people are trying to live on the same amount of land, and so their quality of life, their standard of living is falling. They may even at times experience hunger and famines. Meanwhile, while all of that happens, usually what is happening is their tax burdens are increasing, and usually those tax burdens are falling on the lower class. They're not falling on the upper class, and as we'll see here, there were all kinds of reasons for that, but the upper class was generally exempt from heavy taxation. At one point in time, the peasants, the small farmers, can no longer afford the system, and so they ended up doing what they were doing at the end days of Rome. They voluntarily gave up their land, surrendered their land to larger landowners and said, we can't afford the taxes anymore. Here, take our land. If you take our land, you'll be responsible for any taxes. And since the larger landowners generally didn't pay taxes, that meant that all of these small farmers who had paid taxes were giving up their land, surrendering their land, or their land was being taken over. They were now working as tenant farmers for large landowners who didn't pay taxes. These large landowners were literally lords of their own manors, and the peasants eventually would become serfs. They would become tied to that particular manor, that particular plantation, whatever you want to relate it to. Now, the problem here is that if fewer and fewer wealthy people are coming to control more and more land, and those wealthy people aren't really paying taxes, not very many taxes, they're tax exempt largely, then you can see what's going to happen to the central government in places like Rome. They can't afford to pay the army anymore. They can't afford to build roads anymore, to build aqueducts, or to do any of those other things that governments do. So without the tax money coming in and with the economy declining, the central government falls, as it did in the case of Rome, and things divide up into smaller governments, much, much smaller governments that have their own little armies, and now we're into feudalism. Now eventually, all of this will correct itself. The merchant class will grow, these manorial and feudal structures will decline, a powerful ruler will emerge, and a centralized government will reappear. And that happens after Rome, it happens in medieval Europe, and then medieval Europe falls apart internally and externally, and invaders, barbarians come in, and then things are rebuilt. Now those who worked included slaves. They included free peasants who rented their own land or who held their allodial land that is in absolute ownerships. And they included serfs who were not the same as free peasants. Serfs were servile, that is, they were tied to the land or manor upon which they worked, and they owed the lords of their manor certain fees and duties. For example, corvée labor. And corvée labor was forced labor, literally. Those who fought included vassals, who owed their lords military and political service, usually a certain number of knights, and to pay for the great expenses involved in exercising their political and judicial functions and in training and maintaining their knights, vassals were given estates, that is, manors or fiefs, and in exchange for an oath of allegiance or fealty, that is, faithfulness or loyalty to the Lord. And so they had all kinds of ceremonies of homage and investiture of their land, and etc., etc. And we could go and look at all of this and look at counts, Vassals in turn might grant some of their fiefs or their lands to their knights, who were generally armed warriors on horseback. Those knights, in turn, were sub-vassals of the lord, and sometimes the lord was a vassal of another lord or king, so you would have literally sub-infeudation. You'd have numerous levels of things happening here. And, many of those vassals were commonly called counts, and, you're going to get all kinds of other things here. And you can talk about, all you want about knights and their joust and tournaments and all of that. So this is what a medieval manor might have looked like. Here is where the peasants are all living, and there's their little church. And these fields are going to be rotated, a fallow field, which is, not going to be planted one season, a spring field, an autumn field. And then the peasants are going to take their herds of livestock, and they're going to put them out here in a common pasture that they all they all share, and then they're going to go out into the forest and collect wood that they need. And then here's the lord of the manor, and there's the lord's garden and his orchard, and the lord has a press and an oven and a mill. So, you know, the peasants or the serfs are going to take their grain, and they're going to take it here to the mill, right, and make flour out of it, and then they're going to take it to the ovens that are owned by the Lord, and of course they're going to give a percentage of their crop over to the Lord. And then the Lord has certain lands, and he's going to expect the peasants to work on his land. So that's how a medieval manor worked. There were also those who prayed. And those who worked, by the way, made up, by 800 AD or so, perhaps 60% of the population of Western Europe had been reduced to serfdom. Okay, so literally to being serfs. And the men and women who worked the land in the 12th and 13th century made up the overwhelming majority of the population, probably more than 90%. Okay, more than 90%. Now, if you were fairly wealthy, and if you had children, you probably practiced in Western Europe what is called primogeniture. And primogeniture means firstborn. So that meant that the firstborn son would get the estate. He'd get the manor. And the reason for that is to keep things from being divided up. And in which case, if a rich family had 4 or 5 sons and divided the manor up into 4 or 5 pieces, and they in turn had sons, before you know it, the wealthy people would be very poor indeed. So primogeniture meant that the firstborn son got everything. They try to make certain that the second-born sons would get something, and very oftentimes they sent second-born and other sons off to monasteries, where those sons could become the head of monasteries and abbots. If they had daughters that they couldn't marry off well, they'd send some of them to convents to become nuns. And since they were wealthy people, they weren't going to become ordinary nuns. They were going to become abbesses of these convents. And then bishops and archbishops bishops headed up dioceses of the church, the Christian church. Archbishops headed up archdioceses. So if you were wealthy, a second or third son might end up as a bishop or an archbishop, etc. And then, the monks themselves and the nuns themselves, who were under these mother abbesses and these father abbots, could be just ordinary people, common people and peasants. They seldom became the leaders of these monasteries and convents. And of course the church built all kinds of beautiful cathedrals at this time and founded cathedral schools that evolved into the first universities. We mention this because education is going to become very important to an understanding of how Europe moves from poverty to prosperity. And I want to mention one person who did deal greatly with the poor. He was the son of a wealthy silk merchant in Assisi in Italy, and his name is St. Francis of Assisi. And he gave up everything. He gave up all his wealth. He became a beggar. He worked and helped. He helped the lepers. He helped the poor and dedicated his life to the poor. So this is one of the first instances where you see of these great deeds and acts of charity. Now, just like we took and we developed for you Rome, and then we had to tear it down, right, internally and externally. Well, we're going to tear down medieval Europe externally. Medieval Europe was already torn down and fragmented in feudalism anyhow, and because it was, and it didn't have large, strong central governments, it was vulnerable to external attacks. And so those external attacks began with raids from Muslims in the Mediterranean in the 800s. It continued with raids of Vikings, of Norsemen, from Northumberland and Normandy. It continued with invasions of the Magyars, etc. And so some of these invasions are shown for you here. And just as all of those invasions occur, eventually things are going to start building back up, and you'll start to see a Europe in the latter Middle Ages and the early modern period developing nation states. And one of those is going to be the very fragmented Holy Roman Empire, which is going to literally stretch from Italy on up through what we now know is Germany and parts of France today, and into what we now know as Austria, and of course it's going to eventually get even bigger. So what we did is we established Rome, internal and external problems. Rome falls apart, it's medieval Rome, it's feudalism, and now it's going to start developing slowly into states. You're going to see the same thing happen during the 100 Years' War between England and France, and you can see how over the 100 Years' War, France begins at the end of that in 1453 to start to look like France. And just to the east of France, the Holy Roman Empire. Keep that in mind, because we'll come back to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, we've done a lot, and all I want to say at this point in time is we're going to look at two different places in the early modern period of Europe and see how they handled differently what was to happen in their politics. And England developed a sense of constitutional government and parliamentary government much, much earlier than many places in Europe. And it really develops at the time of James II, who ruled from 1685 to 1688. James II had converted to Catholicism. This is England, which was no longer Catholic. And he issued a declaration of indulgence, actually stopping the operation of all laws against Roman Catholics. His first wife was Protestant, and their daughter by that marriage, Mary, the wife of William, Prince of Orange in Holland, was also Protestant. So too was their other daughter, Anne. Therefore, Protestants in England hoped that when James II died, that his Protestant daughter, Mary, would rule England. But this was not to happen. James's first wife died in 1671, in 1671, excuse me. He declared his conversion to Catholicism in 1672, and in 1673 he married a Catholic, and in 1688 he and his new Catholic wife had a son. And everybody knew that when James died, that son, that Catholic son, would become Catholic King of England. The Protestants became upset, as did Mary, the wife of William, Prince of Orange, and in a bloodless revolution, Parliament offered the English throne to William and Mary. James II fled the country. Parliament offered the throne to William and Mary, provided they accept the terms of a great constitutional government, a document called the Declaration, later the Bill of Rights, which stated that the monarch ruled at the pleasure of Parliament, not by divine right. Now we are seeing the separation of church and state. Parliament is saying, we are supreme. We offer the throne to you. You accept the throne. You sign this document which says you do not rule because God wants you to rule. You rule because the Parliament has asked you to rule. John Locke became the supporter of this bloodless, glorious revolution when he justified its legitimacy for the contract theory of government in a work he wrote called Two Treatises of Government in 1690. And this contract was that there is literally a contract between the governed, the people, and their rulers. So this actually ties in very well to the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, which originated in the same period of the Glorious Revolution in the late 1600s and gained increasing impetus after 1715 with the death of Louis XIV. The precursors of this included thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, and the religious wars of these years had convinced many that you really needed to look at reason, at logic, to get away from, faith-based things and to look at things in a rational manner. And many of the folks who were great thinkers in this Enlightenment movement in France were called philosophes. So some of the great names of the Enlightenment were people like John Locke, and you've heard all this in American history, Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, and they believed in all of these great things like economics, laissez-faire economics, where you just kind of leave things alone and let the rules of economics, whatever they are, work on their own. The invisible hand, literally, of economics. But I do want to go over quickly what some of the ideas of the Enlightenment included. They included the right to happiness, as seen and that's stated quite clearly in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The Enlightenment said that science should serve the benefit of humanity. It said that reason can make human lives better, ridding us of superstitions and prejudice that led to suffering, inhumanity, and injustice. John Locke wrote about the education of children and said that the best way to educate children was to encourage them, to teach them by good example, not to beat them, and that's the thing that they had done quite often in education before then. That prisons should be places of rehabilitation, that there should be a distinction between the public and private spheres, a distinction, a separation of church and state and freedom of speech, that religious tolerance should be practiced, that torture should be abolished, that those in power should be held accountable, that natural laws should apply to society, that all of human knowledge could be synthesized in the new encyclopedia that was brought out by Diderot and D'Alembert, that natural laws could be applied to economics, such as laissez-faire, or the economists who were physiocrats who wanted to eliminate tariffs. These economic theories were in direct contrast to mercantilism, which was the typical policy whereby a nation like England governed its economy and colonies by the use of regulated prices and wages and tariffs. This is going to be very, very, very important to us in Europe from poverty to prosperity. The idea of laissez-faire economics, of getting rid of things like tariffs, of getting rid of mercantilism, of letting the scientific laws, the natural laws of the economy work, whatever those laws may be. The Enlightenment believed in progress, as demonstrated by the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and it also believed in a balance of power, that is, harmony. Many of the important concepts of the Enlightenment will be played out in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, where all of a sudden now, individualism and liberty will take top rank. Not this idea here of group mentality so much, but individual liberty, of money and contracts, not the feudalism of medieval Europe, which had stressed duties and obligations. And we'll see here soon how the industrial and urban structure will become more and more important, and that the new nation states of corporative institutions like parliaments would become more important than kingdoms or empires. If we look quickly at the French Revolution, we look at a rising middle class of merchants, a new bourgeoisie class that demanded equality with the upper class, demanded equality with the nobility. It demanded liberty, not just political liberty, but economic liberty. And capitalism, which is growing at this time period, really does entail the understanding of liberty and of people exercising their own individual economic decisions. But you know, places like France weren't anywhere able to really contemplate the needs of the new world, the new capitalistic world, the new world of laissez-faire, the new world of merchants, of a middle class of merchants. There were all kinds of remnants of feudalism left on the eve of the French Revolution. These things included corvée labor, forced labor, dues and taxes of all kinds. The peasants paid tithes to the church, and these church tithes averaged as high as 7 to 8% of their income. And really, the French society was divided still into 3 estates. The clergy, remember, the medieval those who prayed. The second estate, the nobility, remember, the medieval those who fought. And the third estate, the commoners, those who worked. But the third estate now included not only peasants and artisans, but the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie did not like being down there. The number of nobles by 1789 was only 1 to 1.5% of the population of France. The bourgeoisie were about 30% of the, the bourgeoisie, the first and second estate together were about 4, let's do it this way. The first and second estate together were about 4% of the population. But the first and second estate together owned 30 to 35% of the land. The third estate was 96% of the population, but it only owned about 70% of the land. There were all kinds of internal problems in France. The cottage industry, we're going to talk about that in another time, so I don't want you worrying about that now. But there was tremendous inflation, a depressed economy, bad harvest. 1788 was a year of drought, followed by disastrous storms. Between 1785 and 1789, the price of wheat in France rose 66%. The price of rye rose 71%. Of meat, 67%. Of firewood, 91%. The most depressed conditions occurred in 1789 when the revolution began, with a total increase of that year of 120% in the price of wheat alone. This is what we call hyperinflation. Now, all of this was leading to problems. The cost of living of working classes, especially in the towns and cities. On the eve of the revolution, the cost of bread accounted for 58% of the budget of the lower classes. By 1789, the cost of bread alone was eating up 88% of the working class's income, leaving 12% for everything else. So wages were low, and peasants began to feel that there was an aristocratic plot to literally starve them. It was a paranoia. It was the so-called Great Fear of July and August, 1789, in which many rural peasants armed themselves, and there were frequent revolts. All of this is going to lead to an understanding that there should be a new nation state in France, just like there were nation states in places like England. Cologne was King Louis XVI's controller of finance, and he was faced with this fiscal crisis, and he suggested a land tax, but the Assembly of the Notables balked. In his budget report submitted to the king in March 1788, he estimated expenditures at 629 million livres, income at 503 million, or a deficit of 20%. Interest on the public debt alone consumed more than half the total expenditures, and much of this debt that France owed was due to their support of the American Revolution. Well, Cologne figured that everybody should have to pay a land tax, without exception, even the nobility, the wealthy class, the upper class. And Louis XVI dismissed him. Louis XVI was at best a mediocre king, and he said, there's no way that I can have a land tax on the wealthy. He was facing bankruptcy, King Louis XVI, and so he had to call together finally the Estates General in 1789. It had last convened in 1614. In prior years, the First, Second, and Third Estates each had a single vote, and the Third Estate sat separately. Now the Third Estate refused to sit separately. It withdrew to a large indoor tennis court, and its members took the tennis court oath of June 20th, 1789, declaring themselves the National Assembly and vowing not to disperse until they had written a constitution for France. The people, in support of the Third Estate, stormed the Bastille on July 14th, 1789. This is Bastille Day. This is Independence Day for the French, leading to the deaths of 6 soldiers. This was highly symbolic because the Bastille was a prison comparable to the Tower of London. It was a place of detention for people with enough influence, enough wealth to literally escape the common jails. And it's shown here, are King Louis XVI. In August of 1789, the National Assembly ended all special privileges of the nobility and passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which claimed that all men were equal and free to practice their own religion. The National Assembly began calling it the Constituent Assembly because it was writing a constitution for France. It went so far as to abolish archdioceses, to get rid of the taking of religious vows, dissolving monastic houses. It went after the Catholic Church, even though most people were Catholic in France, because it saw the Catholic Church as a monarchical institution that was for the monarchy. So eventually, it forms its own constitution of 1791, and the rest, of course, is history as things break out into violence and things go from a very conservative revolution to one that is actually very radical. And you don't need to worry about all of that. So what I've done in the French is to take you through the Roman Empire, shown you some internal and external problems, then taken you to the next step, which is medieval Europe, brought that to an end, and then showed you a little bit about the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And now we're going to start to see how the poor people in the French Revolution and the middle class, like the bourgeoisie, are going to fight for changes and fight for their own rights. Thank you, and have a good week.